In 2007, I founded a project called the Visions of Peace Project. I applied for and received a grant from an organization, a foundation in New York called the Open Society Institute. And basically this grant was for people who had ideas about how to reduce our reliance on the criminal justice system, reduce our reliance on prisons and jails in some way, and involve the community at large in doing that. And what I was interested in doing is working with young people, particularly teenagers, to address issues of violence and involve teenagers in thinking about and researching, finding out, and spreading awareness of what are ways that we can address violence that don't rely on policing, that don't rely on prisons, incarceration, that don't rely on punitive policies. And so that was what I proposed to them, and I said I want to do that, and I want to do that with young people in ways that involve the arts and media. Just so that's basically the gist of the project. Involving young people, empowering young people to address violence, and build safety and peace through creative community action rather than reliance on policing, prisons, and punitive policies. Well, before I even go into length of the campaign, I just want to give some context in terms of about the context of what was going on in D.C. at the time where this project was founded, was birthed. What was going on in D.C. at the time was that there were a number of reactive policies that were introduced by various city council members. So the DC City Council, generally each time that there was a high profile incident involving a young person in some high profile incidents of violence. So maybe there were increasing rates of armed robberies on the Smithsonian, or there was a young person shot, or even adults shot by a young person. What would happen at the time is that there would basically a reaction, well, we need to do something about this. And what was done was typically basically zero tolerance policies. Let's crack down on young people by passing laws that basically say that, for instance, if you are caught, are charged with a crime, you are going to not only be locked up, but you're going to serve for a very long time. You're going to be in jail for a very long time. Policies that actually would have even parents locked up for things that their children did. So there were a number of these things, and so a number of people in the city were also a part of a coalition, the Justice for DC Youth Coalition. And as a coalition, what we were doing is saying what we need to change the way that the city as a whole is responding to crime by young people, and specifically violent crime by young people. And so we were actually really successful at that. We were actually successful in getting a law passed. So through organizing, we were successful in getting a law passed that said that we need community-based alternatives to incarceration, not only for violent offenses, but also for non-violent offenses. We were actually successful in getting a law passed that said that Oak Hill Youth Detention Center, which was really violent, inhumane place that incarcerated a lot of young people, needed to be closed. We were successful in getting alternatives to incarceration developed in the city, like alternative, basically like an evening reporting center where young people could go after school rather than being incarcerated. But what happened a few years after that is that there's a cycle again. Incident happens, reaction happens again. So that led me and other people to say, what do we need to change so that we're not constantly going through this cycle of incident happens, there's this reaction, just kind of get tough on crime reaction. And so it led me to be thinking about what's not included in the story that we're hearing about young people and violence. Whose voices are missing and what solutions are missing in the conversation, and how do we need to change the story in order to change how we're thinking about it and actually create some solutions. And so that's just some background in terms of the project. So the project, as I mentioned, began with a focus on involving young people in creating solutions and developing solutions to building safety and peace for young people in the city. But what we learned in the beginning of this project is that you can't actually create solutions until you really have a better understanding of the problem. And so we found that what we needed to do was to broaden the way that we talk about violence. Oftentimes when people think about violence, and it's particularly youth, and particularly in relation to black youth, they think about somebody killing someone. They generally think about black males, black boys, young black men killing other young black males. But really, that leaves out a number of forms of violence. It leaves out sexual assault, rape, dating violence. It leaves out violence that happens to young people. And also it leaves out institutional violence. So what about violence that happens to young people when they're incarcerated or in foster homes or even in schools? What about violence that's actually not a physical act but emotional act or verbal as well? And so we found that when we actually broaden the way that we understood violence, many of the ways that adults and policymakers tended to react to physical violence by young people were acts of violence in themselves. They were violent. And so the reason that that's important is because we basically needed to talk about that in order to say this is one reason why we need other solutions. So let me just tell you about some of the actual specifics, like what do we do specifically, because that gives you kind of some overhead in terms of the analysis. So the first thing that I did in terms of starting the project is I looked for volunteers. I talked to people I knew, friends, other people I knew that I had worked with before, and said, hey, do you want to work with me on this? And the first thing we did is we actually went to detention centers. Well, specifically, we went to a evening reporting center where young people who were in the juvenile justice system, but they were not incarcerated. And then we also went to a youth center. We actually went to Metro Teenage at the time, had a freestyle youth center. We went there and we did workshops. And the workshops were a way of talking to young people about these issues, building relationships with them, and it was also a way of educating youth, help and allowing them to educate each other about these issues. So our workshops might be, for example, a peace circle where everybody goes around and they actually share what is going on in their life at the time. In one of the workshops, a young man in one of the workshops talked about how he in school would just wait for somebody to test him. He basically said, I'm just sitting here waiting for somebody to push me, to say the wrong thing to me so I can blow up. Why? Because maybe, like for example, my grandmother died. I'm sitting in a house that doesn't have electricity. So this, and this, and this, and this, all these things are going on inside me, and I don't have an outlet. So as a result, I'm just waiting for somebody to look at me the wrong way. So those are some examples. And so that kind of got to some of the root causes, like why this is going on. So began doing workshops. From the workshops, we developed relationships with other teenagers in the city. From the workshops, we had our first project, which was called the Flip the Script Media Arts Program. Young people came together, and that project developed a documentary film about different kinds of violence that impact their lives. They talked about police brutality. They talked about displacement, meaning being forced out of the housing projects where they live. They talked about dating violence. They talked about robbery. They talked about people in their lives who had been shot and killed, all of these different things. And they also talked about some of the things that they were doing, whether with organizations they were a part of or just in their everyday lives, to actually speak out and make a change and create some form of safety, whether that was being in a campaign to address police brutality, or whether that was just I'm leaving this abusive relationship. From that, we had some summer programs where young people learned about arts, how to use arts to organize against violence and build safety. We also had an arts and healing program, because we learned that basically in order to really create safety and peace, it has to start within ourselves, and we need to be healed, because hurt people, and healed people can help other people to heal. And so those are some of the things that we did in the project, just to give you kind of some programs, some specifics in terms of what did it actually look like. I would say I'm most proud of, well, I'll mention 3 things. I'm most proud of what we learned about violence when we were able to teach others through our documentary. So we created a 30-minute documentary film, and the film is called Vision is Our Power. And the film is really powerful. The director at the time when we produced it is 13 years old. His name is Leon Baldwin. He's 13 years old, directed the documentary film and did most of the videography. And it was a small group of teenagers in the city who came together, who created this film. And the film, as I said, it really it addresses multiple forms of violence that impact young people, but it also highlights young people talking about things that they have actually done to transform these situations. So I'm really proud of that, and what we learned through that about violence and about solutions and about what's already happening. So we learned about that there's a need to document the positives, to not just document the problems, but to actually document what people are already doing, to lift up what people are already doing in their families, in their communities, in their schools. So that's one thing. That's definitely an achievement, the documentary film. Another achievement, I say, is what we learned about organizing and what we really emphasized with organizing. And what that was, I guess the most important thing, is that organizing is not just about knocking things down. It's about building things up. So oftentimes, and sometimes people think about organizing, think of what do we need to organize against, rather than what we need to organize for. And so with this project, it was much more about how do we imagine possibilities for creating safety and peace for ourselves and our communities in a lot of creative ways. And so that's definitely just an achievement in terms of what we were able to lift up and learn about organizing and collaborating with other people. We went to Detroit. There were about 3 or 4 teenagers. We went to the Allied Media Conference in Detroit, and we joined with a lot of other people and presented workshops there at the conference. We presented our film at the conference. It was a big achievement, and as part of that, we were able to really talk about what organizing means to us in this way. And then last achievement that I'm really excited about and proud of is our work around healing. So through our arts and healing program, it was 6 or 8 weeks long, and teenagers who participated in that program sat together over the course of, like I said, 8 weeks, and shared a lot of the hurt and the trauma that they had experienced and created art around it. And then they put on a showcase, a performance with their family, and were actually able to break a lot of silences. So one person who hadn't stopped talking about the fact that his father was locked up was able to actually break silence on that issue of the fact that his cousin was murdered. And that was actually a big breakthrough, not just for him, but for his family. And so being able to actually bring young people together to get some of that stuff off and actually heal and get free from those things is also a really big achievement. We really created coalitions and built relationships with other people through, as I said, I mentioned before, the conference. So just putting ourselves in places where we can meet people doing similar things. We traveled to New York to a summit called Safe Outside the System that was organized by the R.G. Lord Project, which is an organization for basically Black, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, non-conforming people in New York who were looking at the fact that they can't already rely on the police because oftentimes they're stereotyped and stigmatized and harassed, and so where are we going to go for safety? We can't go to the police anyway. We need to create alternatives. And so they had this big summit around, what they were doing in New York. We went up to the summit to participate in that event. We went to, as I said, to Detroit to a conference. We went to events here through some of my own relationships with other organizations. I mentioned Justice for DC Youth Coalition, which I was a part of. I was also a part of a national organization called Insight Women of Color Against Violence. And so the relationships that I formed through that were also helpful in the work that we did with Visions to Peace. So for example, as a part of Insight Women of Color Against Violence, I helped with a film screening at the National Museum of Women in the Arts. That relationship led to basically National Museum of Women in the Arts being the executive producer of our documentary film. They gave us a camera to use, they gave us funding for the project. So you never know when you meet people how one thing can lead to another. So it's just about being open to opportunities and possibilities. So that's one way that we form relationships and coalitions. Just going to conferences, summits, meetings. Another thing that I did before I actually began working with youth is in DC is I traveled to a few other cities because I wanted to find out what other cities were already doing to address safety and peace in ways that don't depend upon policing and like as I said, punitive reactive policies. And so I went to Chicago to a conference there and just met with people there. I emailed people, did research online, said, can I talk to you? Can I meet with you? I went to Oakland where they were doing some really exciting things, and I talked to people there. Can you introduce me to this other person? So just networking, phone calls, emails, and some travel as well. We actually did not do direct advocacy work with government officials because the focus of Visions to Peace was primarily starting with young people using, as I said, using arts and media to really build awareness in our own communities, to one, change the story that's told around youth and violence, and then to build awareness for beginning with ourselves and our own communities about alternative solutions. Really, one way that I persevered through challenges is surrounding myself and being surrounded by other like-minded people who were really encouraging. One of those people was Jonathan Stith. At the time when I started Visions to Peace, Jonathan Stith was the executive director of the Youth Education Alliance, and he gave me space in the offices of the Youth Education Alliance to work on this project because I didn't have an office space, and I didn't want to just work at home. So he gave me space, and when I would be just sometimes at the beginning of the beginning of the project, it was really lonely. It was, okay, nothing is happening. Where do I start? I'm contacting people. I'm trying to, research and find out what's going on. And Jonathan would push me and say, you just need to go out there and do something. You just need to start. You don't have to find the perfect way to start, but just do something. And so that led me to get out of the office and go into, walk down the street and start talking to organization here, organization there. And one day I was outside of the Arch, which was I think it's closed now, but it was on Good Hope Road in Anacostia near the Gateway Youth Center, or the Gatepost Center. And I was there because I talked to some folks at another organization that was there, the Facilitating Leadership in Youth. It was across the street, and I met someone who worked with young people that their Eden Reporting Center, and that led to going there and doing workshops. So it was really partly just having people around me to encourage me, and then also the youth who were a part of the project were also really persistent. The project was only supposed to last 18 months. It was an 18-month grant that I received to do this, and it was only supposed to be an 18-month project, but really the project went from 2007 to 2012 because the teenagers who were involved said that we need to keep this going. I would say two things to that question. There was a diverse group of people involved in Visions to Peace. And when I say diverse, I don't just mean racial and ethnic diversity. Diversity in terms of age, diversity in terms of sexuality, diversity in terms of where they lived in the city. There were a number of volunteers with Visions to Peace who are white. One, for example, was a college student who was a student at American University. She was very instrumental, young white woman, very instrumental in the project. In terms of the challenges of the project, in terms of how diversity challenged the project, I would say in relation to the issue of gentrification and displacement. What is most important, what I really want people to take away from the Visions of Peace project and the work that we did, is that young people, whenever conversations about young people are had, and whenever there is discussion about what should be done to address a problem occurring with young people, whether that's violence or any other thing, young people must be at the center of the conversation. So in our case, we said that young people's voices are often left out of what should be done around violence and how to stop it, and they were not. And so we created a documentary film as one way of bringing young people's voices to the center, and also bringing the multiple forms of violence young people experience to the center, as well as highlighting the many different ways that young people are already challenging that violence, whether with using organizing or even just using individual actions in their own everyday lives.